Dr. Tatiana Chudakova is the newest member of our faculty in cultural anthropology. A medical anthropologist by training, she got her PhD at the University of Chicago in 2013 and followed that up with postdoctoral studies at Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. And I just wanted to sort of say, we're really incredibly privileged to have Tatiana with us at Tufts, especially at this sort of strange moment of Cold War redux, right? Of sort of Cold War kitsch. We're seeing the rapid resurgence of media discourses of radical difference, ones that position Russia and implicitly all Russians as essentially other to so-called Americans and American values. Chudakova's work, which I know very well, busts through these kinds of myths, generalizations, and highly abstract theories through long-term ethnography in Moscow and Siberia. That is, living with and engaging with everyday patients, doctors, healers, religious practitioners, and scientists over the course of many years. So she builds, in other words, theory and knowledge from the ground up, from the actual practices of real people, and not from our own ethnocentric assumptions about the nature of post-Soviet life and governance. In so doing, her research comes to crisscross so many domains, including the governance of health and populations in post-socialist states, the global movement and circulation of Buddhist knowledge, the ways that indigenous identity and practices are being increasingly commodified around the world, and the dilapidated late industrial toxic environments that were formed across the planet during the Cold War. So we're going to learn some pieces of her current book project today, but I also wanted to mention her upcoming research projects to pique your interest for the discussion after the talk. So her next book is about the pharmaceutical industry's interest in traditional herbal medicines in the Russian Far East, which she plans to follow with yet another book on public health and ecological impacts of rare earth mineral mining for things like cell phones in Mongolia. So please join me in welcoming her.
About the formalize a regional variant of Tibetan medicine. The quotation figured as the motto of the Institute of Biology and several clinics in Buryatia, and I often found it in Russian language scholarship as a rhetorical invocation of Tibetan medicine's usefulness for developing new pharmaceuticals. By the way, can everybody hear me back there? Okay, good. It also cropped up in casual conversations with the practitioners of Buddhist medicine who introduced me to their craft. The statement appeared to align Buddhist medicine's primarily plant-based pharmacopoeia with national and global narratives about the value, both moral and therapeutic, of so-called natural medicine. Now, before I get into more specific questions of medicinal plants and local ecologies, you're probably wondering, what does Buddhist medicine have to do with Russia in the first place? So I will give you a little bit of political and historical background to kind of situate us. Anybody familiar with Siberia beyond, you know, what you heard? Oh, yeah, there you go. Thank you for coming. So located along Russia's border with Mongolia, I don't know if you can see it. It's like right there. It's outlined, but it's the little red outline is very faint. So located along Russia's border with Mongolia, Buryatia has historically toggled between the Russian and Manchu empires that, until the 17th century, shared a porous, contested border. From the 17th to the 19th century, Buryats were an ethnically and linguistically Mongol, self-governing, semi-nomadic indigenous group, and like many other Siberian people, had a tributary relationship with the Russian crown, but were not the direct object of political intervention until the late 19th century. They were the object of missionizing, though. The early 20th century was turbulent for the Buryat, as it was for Russia more generally. At the onset of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Buryatia adopted communism and declared itself a sovereign indigenous state in alliance with the Soviet government. A year later, the Soviet administration was ousted from the territory by the royalist White Army with the help of Japanese troops, and a dictatorship under the rule of a Kazakh warlord was established. Between 1919 and 1920, Buryatia was the site of three competing polities: the Buryat-Mongol state, the theocratic Bulagat nation, which was a Buddhist theocracy, and the great Pan-Mongol state. In 1921, the Soviet faction re-established dominance, and the Mongol Buryat Autonomous Region was created as part of the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic, later renamed the Buryat Socialist Republic, Buryatia, that is. So throughout the Soviet period, much like other regions with a sizable ethnically and culturally non-Slavic population, Buryatia had a special political status and claim to autonomy. However, in 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was renamed the Republic Buryatia and is now one of the federal subjects of the Russian Federation. As a result of Russia's government increasingly centralizing tactics since the early 2000s, Buryatia has lost much of its political autonomy, including the ability to elect its own president, who is now appointed by Moscow. So Buryatia's status in Russia has always been marked as a kind of internal cultural and religious other, in no small part for religious reasons. While Buddhism, and particularly because it was a Buddhist region. So while Buddhism in Buryatia dates to the mid-18th century, a distinct Buddhist medical tradition unique to the region became formalized at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. The process was interrupted in the 1930s by the Soviet government's repression of Buddhist temples and clergy. And you can see this is actually what remains of this early Aninsk Buddhist temple structure, right? So they constructed a new temple, but that's the leftover after it was blown up by the communists. So then in the 1980s, after years of relative invisibility, Tibetan medicine became an object of both scholarly research and medical institutionalization. In 1989, the first state hospital of traditional Eastern medicine, including Tibetan medicine, in Russia was founded in Buryatia's capital city of Ulan-Ude, and the new hospital was part of a regional effort to mobilize Buryatia's ethnic and cultural medical heritage in the service of the local population, and now increasingly of tourist circuits. But the effort to study Buddhist medicine scientifically began in the late 1960s at the Buryat Sciences Center, which was part of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. At the time, part of the, as a massive project of translating Buryatia's pre-revolutionary Buddhist archive. So, okay, back to the question of Buddhist medicine, the four tantras, and the claim that there's nothing in the world that isn't medicinal. During my field research, practitioners of Buddhist medicine, locally known as emchi, which is a Buryat or also Mongol word from the root em, which means medicine, usually refer to plants as quote-unquote raw materials, or in Russian, siryo. While raw materials is also a term used in Russia's mainstream naturopathy, it's a broad economic category that characterizes branches of industry that use natural substances as the basis of their products. Such a framing, especially in the context of Russia's predominantly extractive economy, is both misleading and provocative. It is misleading because the pharmaceutical craft of Buddhist medicine in Siberia has little to do with extraction in its familiar frame of exhumed hydrocarbons and concentrated wealth, which is standard narrative associated with Russia. And it is provocative because practicing emchi know full well that there is nothing naturally medicinal about natural medicines. In other words, the popular notion that certain organisms or substances are inherently beneficial to human bodies obscures the fastidious forms of labor and care demanded by the making of medicinal things. So, Buryat Buddhist medicine, in its current form, emerges from a long history of contentious translations, those of religious scriptures, Soviet botany, post-socialist healthcare, tourist market economies, federal environmental protection policies, and the pragmatics of caring and curing. And I'll briefly touch on some of these things today, but mostly I've focused on plants. The object of this talk is a particular ecological ethics that characterizes emchi practice. I argue that emchi's intense, always shifting attention cultivates concern with so-called plant matters, both the vital materialities of the plants they work with and the matter of tending to botanically potent geographies, which include human and non-human inhabitants in a complex relationship of mutual incorporation. So making medicines, both in the material sense of making medicinal substances and in the more general sense of pursuing outcomes that are efficacious for plants, people, and other worldly actors, is a type of world making. It requires that one assemble and curate the mutable and mutually implicated potencies of human and non-human beings, all as thoroughly social, political, historical, and ecological as they are biochemical. I call this laborious process pharmacopoiesis. Now, I would like to zoom out a little, and you get to look at baby pandas. I want to give you a sense of why I think plants in general are so interesting to think with anthropologically. So within anthropology and science studies, multi-species ethnography has been productively rethinking the effective, institutional, and biosocial engagements between humans and non-humans, in particular by re-theorizing humans and animals' relationships from household to laboratory, from industrial farm to post-industrial forest. Much of this work has also convincingly shown that cross-species attention has a politics. So for example, the concerned public deems certain beings worthy of preservation, so think pandas, while others can be targeted for destruction or neglect. Think this plant right there. So in general, invasive species, right? And one of the critical takes on this politics of attention suggests that such distinctions tend to shift the focus away from the ecological, social, and infrastructural conditions that make disposable forms of life possible in the first place. Okay, but thinking beyond animal life, plants offer their own unique set of provocations. Historically, European taxonomies have tended to assign an ambiguous conceptual space to vegetal life. And although plant sciences acknowledge them as complex organisms, the life of plants is, to borrow the words of philosopher Michael Marder, at the margin of the margin. And actually, if you look at the great chain of being, the devil is right here and the plants are right there. So you can see that they are at the bottom, right? And those two are very different kind of cosmological conceptualization of the natural world, right? One of them is Buddhist, one of them is sort of Neoplatonist. So let's see. So plant vitality transposed into human life suggests pathology. To be alive like a plant is to lead an existence that's perhaps not worth living. As medical anthropologists remind us, a preoccupation with the central nervous system as key to determining the viability of human bodily experiences marginalizes certain forms of human life. I think it also speciates vitality. Lacking such recognizable morphological analogs, plants are vital in dubious ways. In this sense, plants are, in the words of anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, good to think, since vegetality offers a yardstick for evaluating how life itself gets instrumentalized. So by attending to Buddhist medicine's use of plants and its practitioners' relations, both collaborative and predatory, with their vegetal co-dwellers, encourage us to reimagine what questions one might ask of plants themselves. To this end, attention, as both an object of anthropological analysis and a practical element of the labor of foraging and wildcrafting, highlights how human and non-human beings engage in complex, multi-species, multi-sensory landscapes. Acts of attention are both an ethical orientation to human and non-human interlocutors within a multi-species field and a relational practice that shifts the ground of inquiry away from the inquirer, making room for different dialogical and political terrains. So, what might be the value of attending to plants as medicines? Shifting the ground towards plants simultaneously pulls it away from the charisma of the ailing human body. Such a shift helps sidestep human-centric efficacy, in which healing is retrospectively legible solely because it can relieve human physical and psychosocial distress, however defined. At the same time, drawing critical attention to the vegetal lives and forms of labor that make such therapeutics possible does not negate a commitment to care, but expands its boundaries. Attention to plant matters allows one to see other forms of vital dependencies, which do not default to a preoccupation with whether a medicinal substance works, but rather to the question of what sort of work makes its working possible in the first place. It encourages us to develop a distributed understanding of efficacy, potency not as the property of a single chemical compound in a bounded therapeutic relation, but as a complex, ongoing, and often uncertain process, curated through a great deal of labor on the part of many actors, human and otherwise. Now, The committed care for and about plants that characterizes Buddhist medicine in Siberia pivots on practitioners' ability to shepherd natural substances, quote unquote, toward medicinal ends. They do this, I argue, by attending to the layered relations among post-socialist economic and political shifts, Buddhist cosmologies, historical and ecological assemblages, socially rooted ailing bodies, and the mutual incorporations of human and botanical life. So let me try to illustrate this rather abstract set of claims. In what follows, I'm going to draw on several ethnographic episodes to talk about the contingent distributed understanding of efficacy and the sort of environmental ethic it produces for my emchi interlocutors. So, for patients treated by Constantine, a notoriously bad-tempered local emchi who ran a Tibetan medicine clinic in Chudakova, it's a pseudonym by the way, a small Siberian village on the outskirts of Buryatia's capital, the apparent eclecticism of medicinal substances was a source of both wonder and unease. In the building used for storing ingredients, bags of dried plants jostled for space with large vats of spices, jars of mumiyo, which is sort of a fossilized bat droppings, and desiccated snakes. But by far the most alarming ingredient was the bag of human skulls sent to Constantine as in-kind payment from a former patient. The skulls had been collected in a marshy area of Belarus, where the ground had been seeded with the technological and biological leftovers of multiple wars. The skulls were a source of titillated horror for those of the clinic who did not share its Buddhist sensibilities, and highlighted the otherness of emchi medicine. I too initially met this revelation with uneasy laughter at the mental image of enterprising locals, like so many mushroom pickers, gathering the grim harvest, careful to let the decaying artillery shells lie. Constantine, for his part, was not amused. Chiding me for fetishizing human remains, he mentioned a recipe that treats intracranial hypertension in infants and calls for powdered skull bone. You know what our natal wards are like. If something goes wrong, the baby is mostly ignored and probably dies, he offered. Tellingly, Constantine had not used skulls, but kept them around, seemingly in line with the Four Tantras injunction that there's nothing in the world that is not a medicine. This juxtaposition, by the way, these are not skulls. This is a fedra. This juxtaposition of human and vegetable remains in identical burlap sacks as comparable quote-unquote raw materials offers an avenue for thinking about the particularities of vegetal attention in Buryat Buddhist medicine. Such proximities point to emchi's sustained effort to even out the terrains in which human and botanical life coexist. In several Buddhist spiritual and mortuary practices, the offering of the human body, physical or symbolic, and its incorporation into the cycles of sustenance of other beings figures as both an aid to the realizing the illusionary nature of the self and a source of karmic merit. Keeping in mind the economies of tissue and organ transplantations in biomedicine, we may note that Buddhist medicine is hardly alone in harvesting dead, though still vital matter for sustaining human life. Rather, by figuring as explicit quote-unquote raw materials, the skulls functions as a reminder that Buddhist medicine does not shy away from confronting the cyclicities of predation on which it, and indeed all life, depends. This is why I suspect Constantine left the skulls where they could easily be found. They served as a kind of cranial placeholder for the clinic's Buddhist ethics. Such ethics have implications for how we think about and with plants. If the prospect of ingesting powdered human bone for medicinal purposes unsettled the sensibilities of at least some of Constantine's patients, consuming vegetal life tends to evoke the opposite response, namely one of moral or ethical pleasure, both in Russia and elsewhere. In other words, the outrageousness of the skulls draws attention to how naturally plants are available for consumptions and medicalization. In 2014, the global nutraceutical market, which includes but is not limited to plant-based pharmaceuticals, was estimated at $165.62 billion worldwide, with a projected growth of 7.3% from 2015 to 2021. The sector's anticipated expansion is attributed to shifts in the lifestyle preferences of middle-class and affluent customers in developed and developing countries, away from quote-unquote synthetic products towards natural or organic substances, as well as a shift in focus to a kind of enhancement vision of health. So to be sure, the marketing behind natural products might offer a fantasy of purity in the face of widespread industrial toxicity, ecological degradation, and environmental violence. But rather than focus on the dangers lurking at the heart of the moral desirability of naturalness, which does nothing to challenge the concept itself. I want to suggest that the plant matters of Buddhist medicine help us trouble its central logic. In emchi practices, efficacy hinges on the situated liveliness of things, not in extracting therapeutically potent essences from passive, self-similar, and readily available biological matter. Raw materials, be they skulls, plants, animal parts, or mineral deposits, overflow with afterlives as they combine with each other both outside and inside human bodies. However, they do not simply sit still, unaltered, until harnessed for therapeutic purposes, or act predictably when locked into compounded relations. After a plant has been collected, it must undergo a drying process before its post-mortem liveliness derails attempts to stabilize its therapeutic properties. Tree buds might bloom into leaves when placed in a warm environment. Compactly packed plants are prone to fast oxidation, risking chemical changes and starting a fire. When a plant requires to be detoxified in milk, which is what you're seeing here, mold can start feeding off the dairy residue. And let us not forget some plants' tendencies to spring back to life through vegetative reproduction. Ground into smaller pieces for compounding, plants acquire new lively efficacies. Tiny trichomes accumulate into small balls of fluff and refuse to fall through a sieve. The sticky resinous mass of ground fruit stones jams grinding mechanisms. Pepper or nutmeg pulverized to pungent airborne dust, burn exposed mucous membranes. From this perspective, emchi medicine making does not preoccupy itself with a conceptual division into active elements and inert ballast so familiar to Western pharmacology. Inertness, if it ever happens, is the contingent temporary effect of arduous and sustained labor. So, one effect of Constantine's insistence that dead plants and human skulls are commensurate is a reminder that they both used to be and still are vital things. Working with natural substances like plants and skulls requires sustained forms of laborious attention to always particular interspecies vitality and to the deep histories and politics, human and otherwise, that make something available as a raw material. For skulls, it was human death at a staggering technological scale and a protracted economic necessities that enable them to be gathered and bartered. So this brings me to another aspect of emchi practice, which is the very specific embodied understanding of scarcity that it helps develop. In conversation with Sirin Ma, an emchi who worked in one of Ulan-Ude's Buddhist temples, I asked what impact the Russian state's environmental legislation had on her practice. Like many of her colleagues, Sirin Ma relied on seasonal collection to put together the medicine she prescribes. In theory, she explained, one needs a license to forage for commercial use. But who is going to check? And how is quote-unquote commercial use to be determined when Tibetan medicine or Buddhist medicine itself occupies a legally and commercially ambiguous space in Russia? I asked if she had ever encountered problems with the forestry service. No, of course not, she replied. Don't you have wild forests in America? Under the Russian Forestry Code, most of Russia's forests are federal property and subject to government regulation. In the sense, Russia does not have wild forests either, at least not in the sense that Sirin Ma was intimating. But her comment offers a productive corrective to national claims about southeastern Siberia and its natures, and to the competing administrative regimes and imaginaries that bracket the possibilities of making a living in the region. Buryatia finds itself in an interesting paradox, since its chief source of revenue is lumber, mostly sold to China by state-owned corporations in a manner that most local inhabitants find outrageous. At the same time, the federal government actively reframes Buryatia in terms of its non-industrialized ecology. So one such framework is articulated in federal projects for Buryatia's economic development. In 2007, a mandate issued by Russia's federal government classified part of Buryatia as a quote-unquote special economic zone with the goal of bolstering domestic tourism to the Russian Far East, attracting investment for developing local health resorts, and improving the region's economic prospects. In the absence of significant mineral resources and as the recipient of state subsidies, Buryatia has an economic profile that emphasizes regional features suited for a tourist economy, ecology, cultural exoticness, and the absence of an inter-ethnic conflict. Oh, I'm sorry, keep missing one. There you go. The federal plan aligned with local efforts to develop an infrastructure of spas around Lake Baikal, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that flanks Buryatia along its western border. The local government, for its part, actively supports Tibetan medicine in Buryatia as a unique cultural legacy, merging discourses on natural medicines with imaginaries of a medicinal nature. So, federal environmental protection policies that affect Buryatia align with these visions of the region's projected economic future. Because Buryatia is near Lake Baikal, and just to show you that, Lake Baikal, it's partly subsumed into the Baikal Natural Territory, a federally administered environmental protection zone that, to preserve Baikal's unique ecosystem, imposes severe penalties on local industries. Buryatia finds itself towards the bottom of the national GDP rankings by region, and the environmental restrictions make its industrial enterprises increasingly less profitable. In other words, as a region, Buryatia is in the complicated position of having to define itself almost exclusively in terms of those sectors of its economy that are already aligned with the state's environmental regulations, which offers a very narrow understanding of what counts as protecting the region's ecology. As a result of this, Buryatia is also financially unable to update its largely outdated industrial infrastructure, for which it is then fined. Ironically, logging, as well as commercial wildcrafting that depends on not overlogging, right, because a lot of those plant habitats are in the forest, is not a site of regulatory interventions, although you see the sort of IKEA, ironic cedars, WWF has a cedar forest IKEA connection here. So, okay, let's go to this. Political geographers and anthropologists have noted that productivist environments defined by natural resource exploitation and post-industrial sustainable landscapes framed by tourist economies often share the same physical space and operate alongside each other. The coexistence of these different ways of framing the landscape depends on a strategic unseeing that must put in the background certain histories and presences while foregrounding others. What allows for federal mandates and local administrators to reiterate claims about Buryatia's ecological purity and the need to preserve it for the sake of tourists is precisely the progressive decline of Russia's countryside into a zone of infrastructural abandonment. For their part, emchi makes sense of and uses emergent spaces of post-socialist renaturalization. I don't know if you can see this. This is this is a plant, a former wool plant in Ulan-Ude. It's completely ruined, but there's a big sign saying cafe in front to kind of give you a sense of the landscape, of sort of post-industrial landscape in the area. So being able to anticipate and mediate the effects of one's collection practices is an important part of emchi ethics. On one occasion, when I searched for ingredients with Terenma, Tamara, and Aruna, 3 women emchi who had trained with the same senior practitioner, we had to relocate twice before they could find a site with sufficient biomass. The first locales had already been picked over by other collectors, and they had left barely enough for the plants to reproduce themselves next year, to the irritation of my companions. Aruna explained that the depletion of plant populations used for wildcrafting, commercial or otherwise, is not always the result of greed or carelessness, although certainly sometimes it is. Once they had collected a plant on the date that their training prescribed, but it had not sufficiently seeded, and the next year the area was barren. Relocating to a hill with a view of the city, Aruna moved swiftly through the dry grass, pointing out a thistle we had come to gather. While tall, prickly stalks dotted the width of the hill, the territory was bracketed by the telltale signs of encroaching development. A sandy road with construction materials strewn alongside, the beginning of a chain link fence, etc. They will be building here soon, Aruna concluded. We should collect everything there is. I'll be gone next year anyway. So noticing the human and non-human ecologies that frame botanical life is a cumulative mode of attention. This is some of my emchi interlocutors. Cumulative mode of attention, compounded over time through relationships with specific places. There is both a practical and spiritual ethics to cultivating the relationship with a site or its flora, asking permission from the local place spirit, for example, and leaving a tribute by scattering grains or small coins, a practice that is considered part of proper conduct for someone gathering herbs. Place spirits of Savdak also are responsible for human, animal, and botanical well-being, and failures at reciprocal acknowledgement risk misfortune for the offender. Similarly, making sure one's collection does not deplete the population of a particular plant, but whenever possible contributes to its reproduction, ensures that one's relationship to a place continues. Amchi gathering practices are thus especially sensitive to the layered social and political histories woven into plant habitats, reclaimed equally from defunct Soviet visions of development and from the chaotic free market experiments of the 1990s. In this, Amchi have a particular sense of wilderness that does not assume a pristine and uninhabited nature. In other words, Amchi botanical practice should not be viewed as some bucolic model of local sustainability, which offers a fantasy of encapsulated spatial isolation in the face of global capitalist flows. To assemble medicines, Amchi by necessity cultivate informal networks of suppliers to remedy the primary conundrum of how to produce Tibetan medicine's classical pharmacopoeia today, given that its medicinal formulas, initially developed in the 12th century Tibet, were the product of a different ecological, historical, and political assemblage. Rather than a remote margin, Buryatia is one node in this transregional eclectic therapeutic ecology. A favor called in from an acquaintance at the St. Petersburg Botanical Garden might provide red sandalwood. A friendly hunter could supply an illegally sourced musk deer gland because he has not had a steady job since the disintegration of the collective farm that employed him. A geologist acquaintance might have some calcite samples lying around. Calcite is a mineral that's used in Tibetan medicine. And the American anthropologist might be roped into bringing dry sarsaparilla from the US. Amchi operate within a constant sense of a historically, geographically, and politically mediated scarcity. Sandalwood, after all, needs a warmer climate. The musk deer has been hunted almost to extinction to supply the global perfume industry and the demands of a mass-produced traditional Chinese medicine. Calcite might not be rare, but in the aftermath of a post-socialist dismantling of Russia's sciences and academia, knowledgeable geologists who might identify it are. And sarsaparilla imported from India is more expensive and lower quality, I'm told. So, in conclusion. You see now why this cannot be for everyone, Maxime asks me towards the end of my field research. A specialist in Tibetan massage, Maxime followed Konstantin's seasonal oscillation between Moscow and some 2,750 miles east, Lukova. His question continued an ongoing conversation about the relationship between regional imaginaries of economic prosperity and the arithmetic of plant and human life. I often ask my interlocutors in Buryatia what they thought about the local administration's efforts to fold Buryat Buddhist medicine and Siberian Buddhism more generally into the logics of capital as part of anticipated tourist circuits or as the foundation for personal and institutional financial solvency. Konstantin's clinic, with the softly gleaming wood of its log houses, its urbane creature comforts, and its multicolored prayer flags gently swaying between the rustling pines, seemed to testify to all three possibilities. Their regional and personal prosperity and Buddhist ethics intersected in the fluid economy of the homestead. But this intersection was possible, Maxime argued, only at this confluence of a retracted state and a revitalizing but altered ecology. As if to emphasize the contingency of the entire project, Maxime reminded me that, quote, there simply isn't enough for everyone, referring to the plants needed for making medicines. The same plant, if it grows somewhere else under different conditions, it is different. He was arguing, in other words, that plants are always compound creatures, and that scaling up Buddhist medicine to align it with the logics of capital or regional development would alter plants' potencies and therefore its therapeutic outcomes as medicines. A common question one is asked about traditional medicine, both in and outside the academy, is whether it works. Amchi's practices of attentive labor towards plants and other potent matters help sidestep the limitations of that question. They also bring into focus its guilelessly predatory calculus. Maxime's comment highlights how ailing human bodies in the sort of Hippocratic ethical imperative of, quote, applying to the sick all measures which are required, always potentially exceed the human and non-human vitalities recruited to sustain them. The medicines that local practitioners work with take effect through their guided mutability, since they make changes both within bodies and outside them, in carefully measured packets and boiling decoctions, in fungal growths and crunchy stems, in distant symptoms that communicate in the humoral language of, quote, cooled bile and soothed winds. Patients who come to see an Amchi after falling through the cracks of Russia's ceaselessly reforming healthcare system frequently expressed a sense of wonder at this newfound language's ability to provide a paradigm in which the body could relate to itself, One's heartburn and joint pain might well be intimate, as one always suspected. But such senses of recaptured, seemingly natural holistic totality depend on compounded predations. Buddhist medicine actively draws attention to the fact that to speak to itself, the human body needs the living labors and vital afterlives of others. Policy writing on plant-based medicine, both in Russia and internationally, is undergirded by debates over how resource scarcity should be remedied if traditional medical systems are made more widely available at a mass scale and informed by the logics of the market. In this respect, I find the instruction of the Four Tantras equally ambiguous and provocative. The idea that there's nothing in the world that is not potentially a medicine highlights that the process of making plants and other materials therapeutically potent, the process that I have here called pharmacopoiesis, is complex, laborious, and highly contingent. As Emchi often reminded me, the efficacies of plants emerge through their compounded relations with soil, solar radiation, precipitation, and the histories of presences, human and non-human. Plants for Emchi are actually not raw material in the sense of fungible biomass, since the living conditions of a particular vegetal organism affects its relations with the human bodies that consume it. Making things medicinal depends on the intense and all-absorbing work of attending to these fickle entanglements, on identifying, collecting, manipulating, disassembling, storing, processing, and reassembling potent matters, on remembering where plants like to dwell and alongside what others, on being able to identify a plant's potency by taste and make decisions that potentially affect the life of one's patient. It is a practice of scale work as much as it is of world making, of gathering historically contingent social relations between human, plants, and other beings that dwell together and apart. Attending to the labor, both human and not, of making things medicinal depends on paying heed to the mundane contingencies of care. I often heard Emchi discuss a success of their treatment as a factor of whether their male patient had a female caretaker. The efficacy of a medicine depends on its correct administration in relation to time of day and meal times, to the long boiling periods that some preparations demand to complete the detoxification process, and on mindfulness retained in the face of daily repetition. Emchi, patients, and caretakers are engaged in exhaustive practices of tending to botanical and human vitalities, always articulated together. In turn, these practices distribute therapeutic potencies along the temporalities of botanical and human life and afterlife, beginning with the conditions of possibility for a plant to renew its growth each year, through the complex process of preparing medicines, and eventuating in the compounded encounters between human and vegetal bodies. So seen processually as a matter of multiple distributed forms of labor, efficacy is always a collective affair. Thank you.
Hi there. So my question is about, in a broader context, how Tibetan medicine is taking place, or economic-wise. It seems here that it's pretty totalizing. So in that, I think it was the Lake Baikal. The Russian government was trying to set up tourism to come around for that, like wellness being at the lake. There's the medicine aspect, that is the form of medicine that takes place, and then the economy behind it. So am I right in saying, or could you speak a little bit more to see in the broader context of this regional area, is Tibetan medicine something that's totalizing, that it becomes the economy, becomes the way of life, it becomes the work that you do also?
Totalizing in that sense. That's a great question, thank you. For some people it does, but it's a very religiously and kind of like culturally diverse place. So some people in Buryatia never use it, like at all, right? Or use it when everything else has failed. And there's a lot of kind of navigating this very rich therapeutic ecology, for lack of a better word, where people are both drawing in biomedicine on the one hand, or state medicine, but there's all these other alternatives. There's Tibetan medicine, there's shamanism. Depending on what you have, people might go in different directions. So, and usually they combine all kinds of stuff. It does become kind of a, insofar it is part of kind of a very conscious Buddhist practice, then yes, it becomes totalizing. The state is kind of interestingly, so both the Russian state and the local Buryat administration have an interesting relation to it. I mean, obviously, the Tibetan medicine is a global product, right? So it's actually, you have like Tibetan medicine clinics in Moscow, usually extremely expensive. They're private clinics. So it has this sort of presence in Russia and throughout, they exist in Europe, they exist in all sorts of places. So in that sense, that kind of like from the ground wild crafting side of it, that's pretty particular to Buryatia. So there is there's a difficulty in trying to, between that practice, right, which is sort of what I'm trying to talk about in the talk, and trying to scale it up to a state, a kind of a medical kind of provisioning, articulated and managed by the state, right? So that doesn't quite scale up. But thank you, that's a great question.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that the emchi are very connected to the plant world and in the way that they extract it from their medicine. So I was wondering what kind of connection do they have to the land as a whole? Do they practice any type of management practice to conserve their resources?
So it depends. Some of them do. So there's a big variation. There's kind of a so maybe to answer your question, there's a gradation of legitimacy for what constitutes like a proper emchi, right, or emchi, or proper emchi ethics. The ones that make the plants from scratch and are able to use local plants and actually Buryat formulas, so local formulas that were formulated in the 19th century, have kind of I wouldn't say higher status, but are considered kind of in the community considered to be the most legitimate ones. And a lot of this management is both a combination of, so in the case of Constantine, who's a fairly wealthy practitioner, and he oscillates between Moscow and Buryatia, he's able to kind of cultivate all kinds of relations, both local and across the border to Mongolia, to craft these formulas. Other people just, other people might import wholesale stuff from Dharamsala, for example, from India, and just, already pre-made formulas. So it depends, right? So this is kind of the ideal, typical form that most emchi aspire to, but they're not all able to do it. Like, it depends on kind of infrastructural things. Do you have a car, right? Because you need a car to go and collect medicines, for example, because, you have to go off-road, for example. So there's variation.
Thank you. This is such a fabulous argument, and I particularly like the way you are offering this sort of alternative mode of extraction. And so my question is about, it's actually about the status of dirt and soil in this mode of extraction. So I've been thinking a lot, like many of us probably, about pot and about the way prior to this recent election, when medicinal marijuana was legalized in Massachusetts, the way that dispensaries had to practice was by producing their own marijuana.
Yeah.
I mean, you could produce independently for, you could establish a kind of micro set of relationships, but if you wanted to distribute it medicinally on a larger scale, so you had to have your own production unit, which basically mandated hydroponics, which meant that, like, there's no pot being grown in dirt anymore. Yeah. I mean, we kind of know this anyway, but I was probably one of the only people who voted to legalize on the basis of plant liberation, like get the pot back in the soil, you know. So I guess my sense, so I've been thinking about the way medicinal pot is extractive and is extractive in the sort of biocapital sense that we think about it, and in a very literal way too. But I'm so fascinated here by the way this sense of extraction involves sort of managing these entanglements. And it seems like one of the entanglements is with soil. So this is a very long-winded way of asking, are there hydroponics? Like, and is that, why is that not?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I have to think sort of more theoretically about the soil question too. But there are not only are there no hydroponics, but there's no cultivars of this stuff. So medicinal plants are cultivated in other parts of Russia, notably Altai. And they have that sort of like scaled up, really, like industrial kind of production stuff. Most of the folks I talk to are very, very, very explicit about how a plant that's been cultivated is not stressed enough to be medicinal. Stressed, yeah. So plants need to be stressed in order to be potent. So that's why wild crafting really matters, right? So even if you, and like they are, sometimes they are importing because you can't actually assemble some of these formulas. because they require plants like nutmeg or cardamom, right, that grow in India, right, for example. And so they really, it becomes a question of sourcing, but they're really not interested in planting, and they're not interested in the sort of hydroponics. They're really not interested in scaling up. And actually the whole thing around this is like, no, it cannot be like mass produced. No, it cannot be made, sort of at mass scale, which is really an interesting sort of medical ethics question too. It's like, it really, there's an argument to be made that indigenous medicine should not be used by us, right? So that's, and they're making that argument very kind of, not sometimes explicitly, sometimes not, right? So that's, yeah. And it has to do with that sort of plant vitality.
Do you have your hand up?
Thank you. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Wanted to ask, sort of stepping back for a sec, one of the questions I often ask speakers is tell us how you got to your subject. Many of the students in the audience are considering which path they might take in the broad world of the environment, and might be curious about a little bit about your path.
Well, the plant specifically was a later, sort of that focus on plants and that fascination with plants came as a result of the sort of fascination with plants that my interlocutors had, right? So I didn't know anything really about Tibetan medicine before, I went there, and so yeah, it was kind of the process of discovery. Why I became interested in Buryatia? I was interested in medical anthropology, and I was interested in Buddhism. I was interested in that region of the world, so it was more sort of a triangulation between. And then I sort of discovered all the interesting, weird, environmental politics around Baikal and UNESCO that define this region, and yeah, that's sort of how.
Yeah. Hi. This is, I think, working. So I have a question about the kind of the labor they keep talking about that has to go into this process of therapy, I guess.
Yeah.
And it does seem like it's interesting because it's a different ideology of communication almost, where it has a lot of labor has to be sort of demonstrably there for it to be potent, right?
Yes.
For this potency. And I was wondering, it seems like very different than just presuming that there's already connections and that their semiotic material is just going to be transferred naturally, right? It weirdly has to kind of also be manifested, this connection, labor of connection. And I'm wondering, there seems like there's, when we think about labor, there are a lot of different ways to show potency and this effort. And there's a particular, ways of, sort of particular diacritics of effort and labor that you see happening around certain places. Because, for example, sourcing the plants in the wild is a particular kind of labor. However, sourcing them in India would not be demonstrably, demonstrate that effort. So I was wondering, what are the different
That's
sites?
an awesome question. Thank you. This is exactly right? So, this is why the folks who source it from India, who import their formulas pre-made, are like, this is a fake emchi, right? They actually don't know, because if you don't know how to put together the medicines, you have this really kind of, people still have patients because this is in demand, so people will still go and still treat patients, but so much of the kind of labor ideology that you're highlighting has to do with both just this is grueling work, by the way, but in the same way farm work is grueling work, right? You wake up at dawn and you go to bed really far into the night. There's constantly this massive calling things that are really heavy, right? Sacks or whatever. So there's a kind of this kind of manual labor, an ethic of manual labor that has to be made visible, right? Another place where I think there's an interesting intersection specifically with the linguistic ideology stuff is that you have to read mantras in order to imbue medicines with potency, so certain specific Buddhist mantras. And you can't cheat. So there's a long version of the Manla mantra, which is the Buddha of medicine mantra, and there's a short version. There's a lot of contentions when I was helping these folks, right? A lot of contentions whether you could shorten the mantra or whether you had to read the whole darn thing, right? So there's definitely, and there's so in that sense, there's such a performative aspect to this labor that you have to think, I think you're absolutely right. That has, feeds into legitimacy questions.
I had two questions. One's kind of a follow-up to Ninian's question, and others, even though I know a lot about your work, I've never really thought of this. The first one is, you're telling a story, an interesting story, as I understand it, whereby, historically the Russian state, Soviet and post-Soviet, has been kind of, this probably isn't the right word, but a kind of white nationalist state, right? In a sense, right? It's oftentimes highly managed. It's peripheries and so forth. And all of a sudden, we see this moment where there's intense efforts by the central state to valorize this region from Moscow.
Financially, for sure.
Financially and so forth. And I guess I've never really thought to ask you, how were you received in this area as a Muscovite, or were you, at once you have new efforts to valorize, and then the anthropologist shows up as well. And I was curious how you were received there. And the other question is, when I hear your work, I think so much about the transnational circulation of Tibetan Buddhism, the transnational circulation of discourses of health, but it didn't quite dawn on me till I was listening here, is there's also a transnational valuation of foraging happening. It's probably tied up a little bit, at least, with after the sanctions on Russia, with the newfangled valuation of local small-scale agricultures. I'm curious if the folks you worked with at this point, at least, were cued into that, whether it's Scandinavian cuisine or different kinds of mushroom foraging or so forth, of the ways that gathering is globally circulating environmental practice and at this moment.
Both great questions. So I'll start with the second one. So at the time when I was working there, and I wonder what is happening now with the sanctions, and I'll find out this summer, I guess. No, they were not thinking of themselves as part of this global valorization of foraging. They were thinking of themselves as part of a global kind, or like not global, but like a pan-Buddhist medical tradition, right? That cuts across very different geographies. So a lot of the conversations are around, like, is Tibetan Buddhist medicine in India really as authentic as what we're doing at this point? Like, and they were arguing, well, it's not, because they're mass producing all this stuff, right? Like, how can it possibly be authentic? Or like, for example, here you take powders as opposed to pills. And so that was another sort of, that materiality of medicines was another site of debate, because a pill, of course, is for a for consumer practicality, right? You pop it and you're done. Whereas powders, first of all, powders are really hard to take. Like, I don't know if you've ever tried to swallow just a powder. It's not pleasant, right? So, but it's sort of sense that this is the more authentic practice. So it's more around those questions. I'm wondering if now that has changed with both that more official valorization of local products, et cetera, that's happening as a result of sanctions. I'm not sure. That's a great question. About how I was received in relation to the sort of multiple identities. My identity sort of toggled between an American and a Russian, which I suppose is sort of predictable. And you're usually it's interesting, like the Russians usually are more readily identify me as Russians, whereas Buryats more readily identify me as an American, which has to do with kind of colonial politics, right? Or ethnic politics in the region. But it varied. After a certain time, I think the main kind of, and this is like a typical anthropological story, the main reclassification was like, oh, if you're here and you've been here, you've been coming back here for so long, like you must have some sort of Buddhist connection to the place, or like sort of karmic connection to the place, and so you're one of us. All right, so that's a kind of that's another type of reclassification. But yeah, so I think the identity, the frames for the identity toggled quite a lot. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. I don't know. I'm an agnostic about this. So in Tibetan medicine, there's the concept of la, which is very similar to qi and to the sort of what did you call it? Sorry. Qi. Okay. So it's the same thing. So it's practically the same concept, and it has an anatomical counterpart too, like sort of the energy that circulates in particular ways. And I think you need to understand it to understand the logic of Tibetan medicine as well. So it's definitely there. I think the empowerment question, which is the question about mantras, right, isn't necessarily the same question as the one about qi or la. So the kind of consecration of or empowerment of the medicines, at least in the way that it was explained to me by my sort of interlocutors, isn't that it's not like if you're not yourself the kind of potent subject, it's not going to do too much. It might not help. Like it's the proper way to make the medicines, and it certainly won't hurt, right? It may or may not, help. So they're kind of agnostic. At least the ones that the folks I worked with, they're agnostic about this too. But there's a method in which you have to do this, right? And there's a proper way to make it, and you kind of you follow that. But so I guess to a long-winded way of answering questions, I'm not sure that the chi stuff or the law kind of logic and the mantra logic were always put together for me by the folks that I spoke with. There is another branch of Tibetan medicine that's actually, weirdly enough, being popularized. That's the branch that's being very widely popularized in Europe that has to do with kind of meditation and things like that. It's a lot less based. It's not the material side of it, right? Like not the material kind of like pharmacopoeia, materia medica side of it. That explicitly talks about qi and the efficacy of mantras. It's just not so much an object of concern for the folks I worked with. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's thank our speaker one more time for this fascinating topic.
Thank you. Thank you for your awesome questions.
And we will see you after the spring break.